Right, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody from wherever you are joining us. I am incredibly excited today. We've got a really interesting session ahead of us. I'm delighted to say we have Sophie and Emily from the fantastic Brookings Institute. For those of you who do not know the Brookings Institute, I would say it's probably the most internationally recognized and respected education research group in the world. So we are very honored to have Sophie and Emily with us today. So Emily is a fellow at the Centre for Universal Education, and Sophie is a research assistant. And they're going to be talking to us about their playbook around family engagement. So I know family engagement has been a topic that we have discussed a lot. Many people obviously are very interested and very knowledgeable about the fact that family engagement is a real key towards obviously education. But I think we all have agreed that communication with families has become such an important piece around the COVID period. And it's something I think that just made everyone kind of reestablish the importance of family engagement with their community in that period. So today we're going to talk about that in detail. Sophie and Emily are going to introduce us to some of the work the Institute has done, and also talk to us about the playbook that's been developed over 3 years worth of research. So there's going to be a lot of different strategies that are going to be talked about today. There's going to be a lot of time for questions and answers, and also for some ideas to be shared. So please do get stuck in. Do obviously use the chat feature as per usual. Just to say that we will be recording the session. So if you don't want to be on screen, then obviously please turn your cameras off. As I said, please use the chat features as we go along. We will have question and answers towards the end, where you can raise your hand using the reaction screens and ask questions. Come on screen if you'd like, or use the chat features, and do let us know what you think as we go along. If you could also make sure you're muted as we go along, muted until we get to the sort of chat section, that would be great. And without further ado, I would love to pass over to Sophie and Emily to kick us off.
So nice to be here with all of you, and thank you for those of you that have introduced yourself in the chat. Please feel free to introduce yourself. We love learning about the work that you're doing and where you're joining us from, so thank you. And please feel free to also use the chat for any questions, just to reiterate what Mike has said. But thank you so much to T4 and to Mike and Carolina for the invitation to be here. We're really excited to share some of the research that we've been working on, in a topic that is very close to Sophie and I and our team on family, school, and community engagement. A little bit about Sophie and myself. As Mike said, I'm a fellow at Brookings, which means I'm a researcher, and I lead the family, school, community engagement team with our colleagues Rebecca and Sophie and Mike and Max and Rohan and Laura. So we have a robust team of folks, and Akila, our program manager. So we are joining you today to talk a little bit about the research that we've been working on the last 3 years, and some of the work that we're doing with teams around the world and teachers and schools and communities around the world. And we will start a little bit by learning from you. How do you see family school engagement before we even jump in to what we're going to share today? So we're talking about how do we transform education systems through family, school, and community collaboration, but we really also want to hear from you. So Sophie, let's go. So we'd love for you in the chat, in one word, to describe what family, school, and community engagement looks like in the schools you work with today. And if you're not directly working with the school, you can also think about it in a family member or a child that you know, but how would you describe it in the space that you are? How would you describe family, school, and community engagement? So one word in the chat. What does it look like today? Give you another minute. I'm seeing feedback, decreased problem behaviors in children. Disconnected. Sometimes parents don't go along with school guidelines, improving education systems. Take up another minute. Great. We are now going to ask you to think about if you could describe what you hope. What is your hope for family, school, and community engagement? What will that look like 1 year from today? So what do you hope that it'll look like from 1 year today? One word, what would that look like? So please enter that in the chat. I'm seeing support. Harmony, understanding. Excellent. All right. Feel free to keep entering into the chat, but we're going to move forward a little bit. And I think that these words, supportive, harmony or unity, understanding, building of self-esteem, supporting, really thinking about how to improve education systems is really the heart of the work that we're doing. And I join also as a teacher. I teach at American University. And I also join as someone that is involved in as a parent in my own child's school, in parent and teacher organizations, and really supporting the public schools as the side of a parent. So the work that we do as educators, as parents, as family members, and as those of us working with research is really important for our education systems. And so we'll be talking about how we're working together with schools around the world to do this work. So go forward and talk a little bit. I'm going to hand to Sophie to introduce the work that we're doing before we talk a little bit about the research.
Thanks, Emily. So exactly like Emily just said, we wanted to first give you a sense of who we are at Brookings and how we do our research. So the Brookings Institution is a nonpartisan, nonprofit think tank located in Washington, D.C. in the U.S. And what that really means is that we produce policy-oriented and publicly accessible research for a primary audience of policymakers and decision makers. And then we at the Center for Universal Education sit within Brookings as a leading policy center focused on how to help all young people develop the skills they need to thrive in work, life, and as constructive citizens. So all of our work is very equity focused. And as Emily said, we work globally. So that includes work in the US, but also in many other places around the world. So Mike mentioned that we have this big chunk of research, which we call our playbook for family school engagement. And this is what for the past several years, Emily and I and other members of the team have been focused on. The playbook is an online open source resource that offers insights into the benefits of family school community engagement and provides real world examples and tools that folks like yourself can use to help improve engagement in your own jurisdiction. So those strategies and tools are what we will really be diving into today. And we have sort of set 3 objectives to guide our time together today, which is first to give you space to reflect on your own work with family, school, and community engagement. 2, for space to learn from us, from our research, data, and strategies. And 3, importantly, to take away this research and strategies for your own practices moving forward. So how do we do our research? Well, we really work in close collaboration with a network of 50 partner organizations across 12 countries, which includes governments, civil society organizations, and school networks. Thanks to our partnerships with these organizations, we've been able to reach almost 33,000 parents, 8,000 teachers, and 7,000 students through surveys and focus groups. We also conduct interviews and listening sessions with key education decision makers across the globe. We have sourced and analyzed more than 500 strategies from implementer groups working on family, school, and community collaboration to create an evidence bank of good practices, which we call our strategy finder. And of course, we are a research institution, so we consult academic literature and experts as part of our research process as well. I mentioned on the previous slide that we work closely with 50 project collaborators. And this is what we call our Family Engagement and Education Network. And we wanted to share this visual just to give you a sense of the true global spread of our partners and the countries in which we have 14 active current research collaborations. With that, I will hand back to Emily.
Great. And a little bit about sort of why we're doing this research and why this research is so important for the field of education is we really know from deep research in many countries, in many spaces, that when family, school, community engagement is enacted, and when we are bringing family, schools, and communities together, that we support students' learning and development. And so some recent research that really looks at what does this look like in a student's life in school. We know that there are benefits of higher grades and test scores. We know better attendance and engagement, attitudes and behaviors and sense of belonging, but also self-esteem and self-efficacy and some other things that you mentioned in the chat earlier. And really the work that we're doing is supporting young people to thrive in education and really to bring also their families into education. So from the side of the student, we know that there is a lot of evidence and connection to supporting young people to do better in school as well as supporting schools. So next slide. We also know that for schools, family, school, community engagement is really important. And part of the work that we'll be talking to you about is how we're trying to support relational trust. What we mean by that is, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute, but really bringing families and teachers and administrators together to work together, to feel that they can trust each other. And when that happens, we've seen from research that it's 10 times more likely to improve student learning outcomes. So that relational trust is something we'll talk about and is really key to all of this and why we're doing this. We also know that there's some research that shows that when we are thinking about and intentional about family engagement and communicating with families, this can be a cost-effective approach to supporting student and school improvement. We also know that with strong relational trust between families and students and teachers, this sometimes can be more predictive in some research of learning outcomes than even socioeconomic status, which we often think is the biggest determinant of learning outcomes. But we have some research that has seen how family, students, and teachers and that engagement is really important in predicting learning outcomes. We also know that coming together with a shared vision, and we'll talk about this in our work and why we're doing this work, but this really of bringing together beliefs and understanding each other's beliefs, not so that we have the same beliefs, but that we understand each other's beliefs. And when we do this, family, teachers, and administrators, this can be supportive of successful reforms that we need to think about and talk about and do this together for the support of the students, but also of our schools. So this is some of our background research, and we'll share some of the links to the background research that exists already, and then we'll be talking today about some of the current ongoing research that we're doing with teams. So next slide. When we talk about family engagement, we often use this word engagement, but we use it in different ways. And sometimes we talk about it as family involvement. And really, we've worked with a team, a community organization in Pittsburgh, USA, to really, when we've been working with their teams, to think about what does this mean and what are the different ways that families are involved, and really helping think through family involvement versus engagement has helped us think about how do we move families to be more engaged. And when we say family involvement, we often mean telling parents, telling families how we want them to participate in schools. It's communicating with them about new procedures, new policies, new exams, new curricula, telling them about schedule changes, telling parents about how they can contribute. So we think about that more as family involvement. And what we're trying to do is really create more of family engagement, which also creates opportunities to listen to what families think about education, to what some of their expectations, but also some of their hopes for education and some of their concerns and their worries about education, to help bring this relational trust together that is so key to the work that we're doing. And so family involvement is really important, but we're also trying to really engage families. And so it's not really one or the other, but it's trying to involve families, but also towards moving to family engagement and really allowing us to listen to how to work with families and how to work with families and students. So the next slide, our work is really, as I mentioned, built on building trust and this relational trust between schools, between families. And this trust we have found from the research that we've been doing is really thinking about the different beliefs and understanding beliefs in education. And we'll talk a little bit from the data. What do we mean when we say beliefs on education? But we do find from our research that when teachers are more receptive to families' inputs, and when we're able to listen to families feel that they're often on the same page with teachers about what makes a good education and what they need for their children. So this is really important, and it goes both ways. Teachers also feel when families are receptive to their inputs, and families, then teachers feel that they're also on the same page with families. And so this relational trust is really important and a key piece of the work that we're trying to work with teams around the world in doing. The next slide, we'll talk a little bit about relational trust and what we mean. When we say relational trust, we are really thinking about it as 4 key things. We're thinking about it respect and competence, integrity, and personal regard. Respect, it's thinking about, as a teacher, am I seeking input and listening carefully to what families have to say, and vice versa? Are families listening carefully and respecting what teachers have to say? Competence, are we demonstrating to families that we think they're doing a good job as caretakers, and are we as families demonstrating to teachers that we think they're doing a good job as educators? Integrity, are we keeping our word with each other, families keeping their word with teachers and teachers keeping their word with families? And personal regard, and I can't emphasize this enough from the research that we're doing, is this also sharing of care and personal regard. Are we showing teachers that we care and appreciate them? And are we showing families as teachers that we care and appreciate them? So these 4 key components of relational trust is what we mean when we say we're supporting schools and teams to understand and to build relational trust. And I'm seeing in the chat, yes, it is important to show care. And I think this is one of the learnings in these last 3.5 years, is that often things have moved very fast. Things have been very stressful during COVID. We've entered a moment, but this taking time to also show care is really important for our families, for our schools, but also our teachers and our students. And so definitely it's an important piece of all of this. From the research that we've been doing over the last 3.5-4 years is really also understanding what are some of the barriers for the research. So how can we also build on what families, schools are already doing, but what are some of the barriers from the research in building deep family, school, and community engagement? The first point, really lack of personnel, training, and support. And what this means is many things, but oftentimes a lack of personnel in schools to be someone that can take the time to work with families, but it also means lack of training. And we mean this both in teacher preparation in the United States, for example, in teacher professional development and training programs and teacher preparation. There are very few universities that have courses and coursework dedicated to working with teachers on family, school, and engagement. And so we often expect that teachers will know how to engage with families, that school leaders will know how to engage with families, but there isn't often any training. And this has been a big identified area globally. And there have been efforts also to build more training in teacher preparation, but also in service and ongoing training and professional development, a lack of training on how to deal with and how to best partner with families and how to partner with different kinds of families across language and across gender and across race and across different perspectives on education, but also this idea of support. And legacy of structural oppression is also a main barrier. So we, and as you as teachers know, that the way all families have historically been involved in education can be very different across space, but across globally, we do know that there are legacies of structural oppression that do influence how families participate in school, and whether or not families have felt welcome or families know how to navigate schooling as well. And so we do know that ethnicity and race and gender and geographical, rural versus urban, students and parents with disabilities, languages, we know all of these do also influence whether or not families feel welcome and families feel that they have they're respected and their input and that they know how to navigate the system. And so these are some of the things that we also look at in our research. And then finally, attention and funding to research. There's not enough funding and research for schools to do, but also across schools as well to understand how do we really build family, school, and community engagement. And so this is really a key part of the work that we're trying to do, is to try to help address some of these areas in our research. So the next slide, please. So this is a moment we just want to pause and hear from you, and thank you for some of the conversation already that's in the chat. And so take a moment and share with us in the chat, what is the most pressing challenge? If you can think about family, school, and community engagement in the schools that you work with, what would you say is the most pressing challenge that you're facing? Take a minute and then share a few thoughts. Take just another minute, and then we'd love to hear a few of you share your thoughts with us. Take one more minute. So I'm seeing a lot of conversation in the chat, so please keep entering. And I was going to ask if a couple of you may share. And Khaled, you have a really important point that you have in the chat about this importance of time for bonding. I was hoping you would, if you wouldn't mind saying a little bit more about what you've written in the chat.
Khaled, do you want to come on screen, Khaled, and just add a little bit more color? If your network's good.
Maybe he has some connectivity issues because he's writing, but he doesn't seem to be hearing us.
No problem. Okay, I'm gonna, if it's, I really think this is a important statement that Khaled has contributed, so I'm gonna read it out loud. But our students come from very challenging backgrounds, so we cannot focus only on academics. I feel it is necessary for teachers to spend some time bonding with students. It is very important for me to bond with their families, as the difficulties faced by the families are also related to my child's background. As a teacher, I feel having this complete triangle connected to each other is very important. And so I can't emphasize enough this taking, so thank you so much, Khaled, for this contribution, but really taking this time to understand children and families. We know from the research of how important that is, and Khaled knows from the work, and you all know from the work of taking that time. But also I like this image of the complete triangle of connecting. And this is this triangle is something that we're going to come back to, and related to Kalyane's point of, and the question about what does it mean when we talk about alignment and sharing of beliefs, and we'll come back to that. And really what we're talking about is understanding teachers and parents' beliefs. And really there is a triangle of understanding this these beliefs across students, across families, and across teachers. And so thank you so much, Khaled, and for those of you that have contributed in the chat. If there's anyone else that wants to briefly share their thoughts from the chat, please go ahead and raise your hand, or I can read some as well. We can move forward. If anyone wants to share what they wrote, please feel free to raise your hand. No worries. I'm seeing a lot of great conversation in the chat, so I'm going to just recap some of them and we'll move forward, and there'll be other opportunities to hear from you as well. I'm seeing that sometimes you're finding that parents don't always believe that that when the teacher is telling them your child is having a difficulty, that families are not always hearing that or able to hear that. I'm seeing that there are some parents who are less engaged with school activities and that are struggling to help their children at home because they're thinking about how to provide for their basic needs. And so we have been hearing a lot about this research, and we'll talk about this, about some of our expectations for families, and also what are some of the challenges that families are facing in supporting their children, and not just in the school and physically in the school, but also at home. So this is a great point. And then I'm also seeing an idea of parents and wanting to be involved, and whether or not some families want to be involved in their day-to-day, or that they, and then maybe I'll reframe this as that they know how to be involved in these. And I'm seeing examples of low attendance at parent-teacher association or parent-teacher organization meetings, school management type of meetings, and some challenges with getting families to be involved in that. I'm also seeing really creating a understanding of school and what is the importance of school as well. So some of the contributions that you've all made, and we'll talk more about these. So we'll keep moving forward. But really, to the points that you've all made in the chat, the work we're trying to do is start an intentional conversation to help understand beliefs, but also to help break down some of these barriers to building family, school, and community engagement. And so what does this mean? This means for us, we have been developing, so if we go to the next slide, a set of tools. And as Sophie mentioned, all of the work that we do at Brookings is open source. It's free to the public. And the work we're doing is to really support teachers and schools, school leaders, policymakers, civil society organizations, and NGOs do the work that they do with research and more intention. And so this work that I'll be talking about is co-created with schools in a number of different countries. It's based on the research, but we're also developing research together so that school teams and school leaders can have tools to do their own work and research in schools. So that research is not just for those of us in an institution like Brookings, but it's also for those of you that are educators, that you have tools to use in your schools to really understand families and to generate conversations using evidence. And so that's what our conversation starter tools are. And we have been developing over the last couple of years with teams. And at the end of this year, all of our tools will be sort of open source and open to the public, and we'll be publishing all the research that I'm talking about today. So if we go to this next slide, we have 4 key steps of our process. The first, contextualization. And when we start with teams, and so to the point that was asked in the chat, how do we work with civil societies and non-government organizations, and the work that we're doing right now in this conversation starter process, sometimes it's working directly with schools and school leaders. Sometimes it's working with a civil society organization or a community organization or a nonprofit or a non-government organization that works with schools, that are supporting schools. And so when we say contextualizing and centering in your community, I'll give a little bit of example in a minute about what that means. Our second step of the process is to really survey teachers, families, and students to really understand their beliefs on education, some of their perspectives on education. Going back to Khalid's point about really this triangle of understanding this triangle, that's really what we're trying to do with capturing beliefs and perspectives. And then we have a process of sharing and discussing and reflecting together on the data and discussing beliefs. So when I say we, I mean in school teams, teachers and families really coming together to understand what they have found from their surveys on beliefs and perspectives, and ultimately using these conversations to develop strategies that can be enacted in schools that are based on the context and based on what the parents and the families and the teachers' needs and the students' needs are in these schools. So this is our conversation starter process, and I'm going to go through a little bit more in depth what are these 4 different steps, and give you all an opportunity also to ask questions. And feel free to hopefully we'll have a conversation at the end and you'll have time to ask questions about this process, but feel free also in the chat to, as you're thinking of questions, to add them as well. So the first part, contextualization. So when we're working with teams around the world, we're really thinking about why are we doing this work? And so we're working with 14 different jurisdiction or country teams. So we're working with teams in Colombia, teams in Brazil, in the United States, England, Australia, Sierra Leone, Tanzania, South Africa, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and I'm missing a number of countries, Hungary, hopefully, and Netherlands. We're working with different teams in different spaces to really help build this practice together and build these tools together. But when we start with each of the teams, we think about what are the critical demographics and issues to consider in the communities that we're working with. So these are thinking about why we're doing this work, but also who are our families and who are our teachers in this work. It's understanding education and literacy levels of families. It's understanding the languages spoken at home. It's understanding gender of parents, of parent involvement and family involvement with gender, as well as families and children with disabilities, understanding race and ethnicity, socioeconomic status of families and teachers, but also the geographies. And when we say geography, we mean urban or rural or semi-urban, suburban. And so we think about all of these at the start of this research, and who in our schools have sort of been more historically engaged, and how have schools been structured to ensure that we are including families and trying to include all families, and especially those families that have historically been more marginalized and not reached through schools. The second part of our process of capturing beliefs and perspectives, and I'll share you some of that data, which I think will really answer some of Kalyani's questions earlier. But we try to capture the beliefs and perspectives, and not to make generalizations. This is participatory research, but it's really to understand beliefs on education. And we'll share with you when we say beliefs on education, we mean, what do parents and teachers and students think the purpose of school is? What do we think? When are we most satisfied with education? What are our beliefs on teaching and learning, on pedagogy? And then we also asked questions on relational trust, and we went over those 4 areas about care, integrity, feeling respected, and believing in each other's competence as families and as teachers. And so we really measure relational trust and our beliefs on relational trust, but also whether or not we feel that we share some of these beliefs on education with each other, meaning teachers are sharing those with families and families are sharing those with teachers. We also look at different types and ways that families are involved in school. You noted in the chat already a few of the ways. Some of the ways that we often think about are through committees and parent-teacher organizations, but that's just one of the ways. And there are many ways that families are involved in school, also important ways in their own children's learning at home. So family school community engagement doesn't just happen in a school space, but it happens also importantly at home with children in communities as well. So we talk about those in the survey and understand what's some of the ways that families are engaged. And then we look at barriers. What are families and teachers and students seeing as a big barrier for family involvement in education? So these are what our surveys measure. We won't have time today to go over the full survey, but we'll share a couple of the questions with you from the survey. So to the next slide. First, before I jump in to the data and what you'll see around the world, we wanted to take an opportunity to really understand, what do you see? So we'll start with one of our key questions. And we're going to ask you, what do you think is the most important purpose of school? And we'll ask you to choose in the chat and designate in the chat. You can choose one of 5 options. So is the most important purpose of school, and we're talking about school specifically, is it to further education? Is it to develop work skills? Is it to be active community members or citizens? Is school to develop oneself and develop social skills and values? Or if one of these 4 purposes really doesn't capture your belief, you can also write other in the chat and explain what that belief is. So let's take a minute in the chat to write, what do you think is the main purpose of school? And you can write academic, economic, civic, or social emotional, the short code on the right. So what do you think is the most important purpose of school? Give about 10 more seconds if you haven't written into the chat already.
Quite a hard question.
It is a hard question, and we'll have a little bit of time at the end also to dig into some of why we're asking this and making you choose. Can I, keep entering the chat. Can I ask one or two of you to share? So I see Kalyani has her hand raised. So share why you chose the purpose that you did. Go ahead.
Thank you, Emily. Actually, I work with students and as well as parents a lot. My work is communicate with parents. So I faced a lot of challenges. Even midnight also they disturb a lot because their lack of sometimes literacy and even the knowledge on the topic which we create. And I feel that civic, that is active community members or citizen, this is the qualities we need to develop within the students to understand the socio-emotional skills that gives the value of how to live in the community, how to follow the ethics. Then they automatically understand the value of education as well as the economic working skills. So I always worked on these 2 areas very closely to bring them the knowledge and the working, entrepreneurship or leadership skills based upon these third and fourth topics. So it's my personal experience, and I can recommend these two as per my idea. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing. So I heard socio-emotional really important from your own experience and from what you're seeing in schools, as well as, and you said D, as well as the civic piece of it. Great. Anyone else that wants to share why you chose the purpose that you chose? Please feel free to raise your hand. Or maybe I'll ask Carolina, if you don't mind sharing, why did you choose the choice that you chose, Carolina?
I'd say academic because maybe the other ones can be learned within the family. I don't know, maybe thinking in my own history, I don't know, I learned with my dad, with my mom, how to get some social and emotional skills that my school, of course, got me better at this, but this was not an essential task of the school, as for example, to learn math, biology, and I don't know, some other academic subjects.
Thank you so much for sharing. And we've heard this echoed exactly what Carolina has said from a lot of parents as well, is also what do we believe is the role of the school? And what do we think that parents can do with their children at home versus what schools should be doing? And so for some of you, you probably say this is important. And I think as educators, we would say all of this is really important and the role of schools. But why we ask you to choose one is to really be able to start to hone in on conversations and to really, if we chose for a cross, it would be hard to really kind of start to build these intentional conversations on purpose. And what you have just shared, Kaliana and Carolina have just shared, are different perspectives on the purpose of school from what you've seen and what your experience is as even probably as students in school, as parents with school, as educators working with schools as well. And so we know that our beliefs are influenced by our own experiences. And so helping us understand and have these dialogues is what we're trying to do through these conversation starter tools. So we'll move to the next slide, but we'll have some time at the end to really talk about this. And so beliefs in Colombia, we'll talk a little bit about the data that we've collected with primary schools, 41 primary schools across Colombia, and some of the beliefs that they have found in looking at this question. So going back to why are we asking and how do we understand these differences in beliefs, or these alignment in beliefs, as we sometimes call them, we take all these different beliefs that you've just answered and we map them and we look at the differences where they overlap and where there's bigger spaces. And you can see the biggest space is on academic. So the blue circle, if you can see blue, or the 48% that has a box around it, is parents' beliefs. This is what parents in primary schools in Colombia thought was the most important purpose of school. And the orange circle, or the 48% now with the box around it, and the socio-emotional, is teachers. So teachers thought socio-emotional was the most important purpose of school. And so they had different priorities in how they saw the importance of school. Teachers prioritizing socio-emotional and parents as academic, for just the exact reason that Carolina has noted. This, what do we expect teachers to do, and what do we expect families to be able to do? And so families are really expecting that when their child is going to school, that they're more focused on academic learning, but teachers are saying in Colombia, socio-emotional learning is key. And we'll have a little bit more conversation about how do we build that into a conversation in a minute. Let's look at perception. So one of the questions that we also ask on the survey is perception of the other. So we ask parents to think about what teachers think. We ask teachers to think about what parents think. And for those schools that we're working with, secondary schools and above, we also ask about students. What do students think about their teachers and their parents as well? So understanding these perspectives help us understand where there are large differences or there are even similarities in our own perceptions. In this case, the circle again is the parents' actual belief. They said that academic learning was their priority, and teachers, for the most part, you'll see only a little bit of white space between the diamond. The diamond is the perception that teachers have of parents. The space between the actual beliefs of parents and what teachers perceive of parents is quite small. This means that teachers understand their parents in these schools in Colombia for the most part. Even though they, as teachers, prioritize social emotional learning, they understand that their parents are prioritizing academic learning. When we look at this from the other perspective and whether or not parents can understand teachers' perspectives, we see a little bit more white space. We see, again, the circle being teachers' actual beliefs and the diamond being parents' perceptions of what teachers believe. We see the biggest gap between the academic. So that teachers actually are putting academic lower than socio-emotional, but parents think that teachers are prioritizing academic learning. And herein lies a tension that is part of what they're leaning into and having conversations about in Colombia. And so while the teachers understood the priorities of the parents, parents didn't understand the priorities of the teachers. And we see this as an important opportunity to have a discussion and an intentional conversation. We'll keep going. I'm going to show you another belief in Zanzibar. Before I go there, also, one of the things we ask is also to understand barriers and ways that families are engaged. And so in a recent study we just did with schools across England, we found a very big difference between the barriers that teachers saw and the barriers that parents saw. We saw that parents said the biggest barrier, and we're finding this across the globe, one of the biggest barriers is time, that families struggle with time. Sometimes they have children at 3 different schools. So how do they engage? For the point that was in the chat earlier, they're really worried about getting food on the table, about being able to feed their families, having time to be really engaged in the ways that schools imagine family school engagement is very difficult. We also see financial resources of being engaged in the schools, as well as time to be some of the biggest challenges. The other being communication with schools. For the perspective in England and the responses from the side of teachers, they said that the biggest challenge of families getting engaged was their lack of motivation. So they saw it as families are not motivated, but families didn't see it that way. They saw that they were actually motivated. They just didn't have the time. They didn't have the ease, and they explained for the reasons I've mentioned, multiple children at different schools, really were worried and concerned about meeting the basic needs at home, not knowing how to be engaged, not feeling always comfortable being engaged with the school. And so part of this is also remembering that we do have different perspectives, but also trying to help us understand the assets that we bring as parents and teachers, but also the challenges that we face, and also understanding these is really important. In Zanzibar, Zanzibar is a semi-autonomous region in Tanzania and East Africa. And we worked with secondary schools across the region to look at family school and community engagement. We worked with a civil society organization that works very closely with government schools. And so in their survey of secondary schools, here's what we found. We looked at it with students as well. And so we're sharing this because we also are trying to understand how do students' perceptions. And we know often as children get older from the research that parents get less involved, in part because parents don't necessarily know how to be as involved in the older ages, but also because students are less interested in having their parents involved as they get older, right? And so we know early childhood, often families have to be more involved as they're taking children to school and following up with their smaller children. And as they get into primary school, and then student engagement shifts also, as parent, student, and community engagement shifts as children get older. And so understanding these across ages is also really important because beliefs can and do change across the age of a child. So in this case, we found the blue and the green. The green is the student's belief, the blue is the parents, or the 54% and the 45% on academic was the priority for secondary school parents and students, the priority and the purpose of school. For teachers of secondary school students, they actually prioritized academic and civic. So yes, academic was there, but actually economic and civic was higher. And I should say that these students that we were working and the teachers are about to take their high stakes exams. For those of you that know the form system, they're at form 2, they're form 2, form 1 students. They're in a year or two will be taking their high stakes form 4 exams, the end of ordinary level, secondary level exams. And so this is, students and parents are very focused on getting them through to the exams, going on to hopefully to the next level. And I should say the demographics of these parents, these were predominantly rural schools, and I think it was about half of parents, or a little bit more than half of parents, had never been to secondary school students. So their child is the first in their family to have gone to secondary school. So they're very focused on this idea of getting their children through school, their idea of social mobility. If my child gets an education, they will be able to get a good job and help the family, this idea of the importance of education in this role. Whereas teachers were also focused on the economic and the civic. And we'll talk a little bit, we can talk a little bit in our kind of conversation of why that is, but we're looking at that right now with teachers in Zanzibar, and they're having conversations. But these teachers also know that a huge percentage of their students will not pass the exams and they will not go on to higher education. And so they're also looking at the data and their knowledge of their own students, and also trying to prepare them for work skills, as well as the deep belief in civic importance of education, of which many of these teachers are coming from an environment where civics and education is a very deep part of the history of Tanzania and the education system. So different priorities of secondary school parents. When we look at perceptions on the next slide, we can see there are bigger gaps. So in this case, the circle being teachers' actual belief, which was economic and civic as being the main purposes. And then we see, but parents and students are perceiving that teachers are really prioritizing academic. So again, this is a great space to have an opportunity for parents to ask the teachers, why are you prioritizing economic and civic? And the teachers asking the parents and the students some of their concerns and their focus on the academic part of learning. And you can see for everybody, socio-emotional is quite low, which we do see as kids get older, beliefs on socio-emotional as being a key part of learning gets lower as we go on through secondary school. And so there's also a conversation to be had about socio-emotional learning, as we've heard a lot from school communities around the world, particularly after COVID, and the challenges of mental health and really children and families really being able to, and teachers really supporting their well-being. And so this is also why socio-emotional is so low, as part of the conversation that hopefully they'll be having soon with their schools. When we look at it from the other perspective and about what teachers perceive of parents, so to the next slide, you'll see again the circle being parents' actual beliefs, which was academic. Teachers, the space is a little bit closer. So teachers thought that parents were really prioritizing economic and academic. And students also perceive that teachers are prioritizing academic and economic. And so a little bit smaller gap than in the teachers' actual perceptions, or the parents' perceptions of teachers, but still this is an important part of the conversation as well. So we'll keep moving forward. So when we look at this globally and look at what our teachers and parents saying globally, here's some of the trends that we've been seeing so far. We've seen that the largest for teachers around the world are really prioritizing social-emotional learning. And some of this data collection was happening during COVID, but a lot of it is post-COVID. So still socio-emotional learning as being an important purpose of school. And for exactly the point that Kalyani mentioned earlier, that they're seeing the importance in order to help our students learn all of the academic and the math and the literacy about the importance of the socio-emotional. And so teams in Canada, British Columbia, California, Colombia, Cruz, Brazil, Ghana, Maharashtra, India, Malaysia, South Australia, Pennsylvania, and other parts of the US, prioritizing socio-emotional of teachers. There are teachers, though, in particularly in Londrina, Brazil, and in Zanzibar, that are prioritizing civic. And in Sierra Leone, teachers were prioritizing academic. And I should note that in Sierra Leone, they had a bit different demographic. 75% of the parents had not gone on to secondary school, and almost half had not gone to any primary school because of the disruption with war. And so this is also a school system that has been rebuilding and being recreated post-conflict as well. So we look at different contexts and see what do teachers and families say. Let's look at some of what families and parents are saying. And we're using parents here, but we mean families. So this could be an uncle or a grandparent or whoever is kind of the main caregiver and the family member in these different beliefs. So those are who would answer the survey. The jurisdictions or the countries that believe sort of socio-emotional from parents were Botswana, Ghana, Buenos Aires, Argentina, and British Columbia, Canada. So those parents were emphasizing the most important purpose of school, socio-emotional. We saw in 2 different states in India a very strong civic purpose of school, and in a number of jurisdictions, Brazil, South Africa, Sierra Leone, Zanzibar, Tanzania, Colombia, and in California, that parents were really emphasizing academic purposes of school. So in summary, purposes on school can look different in different spaces. It can also look different among family members in one household as well. So beliefs can change over time, as we've said. When we look at students, we're still sort of building our student and understanding what students are having to say. And these are secondary school students. We see them, the majority in the countries that we've been sort of surveying in South Africa, India, and Zanzibar, Tanzania, academic purpose of school was sort of where young people were focused. But in Ghana, students were also saying, and youth were saying, socio-emotional is an important purpose of school. So there is a conversation even among students, but generally we've seen a trend towards more of the academic purposes. So we'll go to the next slide. In our barriers to involvement, as mentioned before, we look at these we look across countries as well as within. We found that for parents, the financial constraints being the highest for Sierra Leone and Tanzania, but also lack of time. In the other countries that we've been working with, we found that for families, really they see lack of time and financial constraints. For teachers, go to the next slide, Sophie. So for teachers, as I mentioned, we're still trying to understand that, but oftentimes we're finding that teachers are not, they have different beliefs on the barriers, and they have different beliefs on how families are engaged. And so understanding that of sometimes where teachers are thinking that family engagement should be through a school committee or it should be volunteering at events. But we actually know that the majority of families, the ways that they're most engaged is through their own children's learning at home. It's the day-to-day communication with schools. And so we often ask and have teams think about that when they're having conversations with their schools about how to build on the ways also that families are already engaged, and how do we support families to be even more engaged in their children's learning at home, and how do we make communication even more easier. And so these are some of the different opportunities for building on family school communications. Before we go any further, let me just pause and see if you have any questions, and feel free to raise your hand or ask in the chat. I see Kalyani, go ahead.
Emily, your research is absolutely too deep and very, I can say it's a massive, and I should appreciate your team and your patience in conducting this survey in different countries. And my point is always a concern, how do we educate parents, at least 50 to 30%, to understand the level challenges of the educator, or even challenges of school. They expect everything should be done instantly. When they pay the fees, they expect everything should be done instantly, and they don't have the patience to listen or understand the ideas of the teacher as well as the school management, what they're facing. So sometimes we used to organize even coffee evenings or coffee mornings in the weekends, but even for that they're absent. But they still keep posting the questions, which is unbearable, and it's going to be a stressful, I can say, a stress creation for the teachers as well. So as a bridge barriers of a student engagement programmer, I always try to give them a kind of activity to bring them to the school. But is there any kind of task which you people want to suggest, or you people have conducted research on the parents' mentality? Every school can give them a kind of course, at least, weekend course. Is there any kind of thing have you planned? If you plan something, just share 1 or 2 ideas so that we can implement in our schools, especially our south part of India. Parents are very conservative. They don't even understand. They only focus on one particular topic. They want the marks. They want the fees should be less. The schools have to give them more protection. They don't concern about what internally the gap between. So we need to educate them. So what kind of education type of course we can give to the parent, we can implement in each school, that will help the each school management as well as to cut down the stress of every school class teacher. Thank you.
Thank you. So the question was, just repeat it, is kind of strategies. And I'm going to also note that Sophie is going to talk a little bit about some of the different strategies. But the question was, as I understood it, was really looking at strategies for how do we work with families to help them understand the various pieces of school. And just one clarification, when you say challenges and more concentrated on fees, are you talking about more private schools or public schools in terms of?
It's all private school. Public schools in India, they're all government schools.
Right.
So the fees will not be there. Private schools are having too expensive to bear from the parent, but still they're ready to come sometimes. The reason is they are expecting more than the fees they pay.
So the reason I asked that question is we have also been finding that it can be different for private and public, right? Because of exactly what you're saying. So when a parent is paying a fee and what they expect out of engagement is different. And so the strategies that we will share are for private and public schools, but it is important to keep in mind that these expectations, as you're saying, can be different of vice versa of the schools with private. And there's different issues on family engagement with private and public schools. But the strategies that we'll be sharing are really across both. I would say for us, one of the key things that we're trying to do is create opportunities to also listen. And so when we think about educating parents, we often are thinking about focusing on telling them what they need to know and telling them. And as the work we're trying to do is not just telling, but also listening. And so a number of teams around the world, including our teams, 2 teams in India that have really tried listening circles with families, like you're saying, but also finding out how to do those learning circles is really important, because parents are saying that time and financial resources are the biggest barriers, structuring them at times when families can participate, but also in ways that they feel participating. And we have found that when you structure events at school, that there are certain families that will not be present. And sometimes we think it's because they're not motivated, but when we're actually digging into the research and some of the in-depth research, we're finding that families also don't feel always comfortable. Sometimes they come to school with their own traumas of being excluded. Maybe they haven't been to school, maybe they're not confident, or maybe they didn't have a great experience as a student themselves, if they were a student. And so understanding that our parents a little bit more deeply and understanding the challenges and structuring conversations to listen, we found to be really an important piece of it as well. And so I think that's one important learning that we have had, but also rethinking schools. We often think about it as parents that are hard to reach or families that are hard to reach. But often when we do the research, we find that schools are hard to reach for many families. This could be class, it could be race, it could be ethnicity, it could be language, it could be literacy, it could be a combination across disabilities. And so part of what we're trying to do is understand how to make schools easier to reach. And so some of the strategies is also holding conversations with families outside of the school, especially, and for us, it's also listening to families that are historically less engaged or more marginalized in school that we want to hear from. And so how do we create opportunities to really hear their voices, and not just the voices of families that already are highly engaged and feel comfortable being engaged. So we'll talk about that in a minute. So that's a really important question. And we'll share some of these strategies. Carolina's point of that schools are hard to reach, and they shouldn't be hard to reach. And we know that is the case, and that's kind of as educators of our hopes of really building and breaking down these. But I think for what we have found is it's really important to help understand from the perspective of families. How do we make schools easier to reach? Okay, so let me keep moving forward. We'll have time for questions at the end, but I want to really make sure that Sophie has time to share some of the strategies with you, because we have a strategy finder database that you can all use, and we'll share it with you as well. And that we're building, if you have ideas as well that you want to share with us. Okay, the next step of the process, once we've looked at these different beliefs on the purpose of school, the different barriers, the different ways that families participate, we take these into conversations. And so the schools that we're working with will take some of this data, they will sit down with parents and teachers, and sometimes it's parents having their own conversation first, and then a mixed conversation of parents and teachers, but a really an important opportunity to listen to each other. So in the case of Colombia, this was understanding to the point of why families are so focused on academic learning, and for understanding from the point of teachers why they're so focused on socio-emotional learning, and understanding these beliefs, but also understanding some of the barriers. So that's what happens next in our conversations. And these are quotes from Pennsylvania, and when from one of the teams in the US, they found that when they used tools and started the conversations, that it immediately cut through the tensions. And so in the US, we've been having, if you may have followed or heard, that we have had a hard time talking about socio-emotional learning. Some families feel that socio-emotional learning shouldn't be what should be taught in school. They find it, what does that actually mean? And so having some data helps us cut through these tensions. In some of the quotes in Colombia, it was exactly to Carolina's point of that parents felt like they could help their child at home with socio-emotional. I know how to do that. I don't know how to support my child with academic learning. So I need teachers to help with that. And that anxiety they have, if teachers are focused on socio-emotional learning, what are you helping with my child with these basic literacy and foundational math that I can't help do? And teachers having the opportunity to say, actually, socio-emotional learning is part of what we do. We're not stopping teaching literacy and math and all these other things. It's just, we need children to feel confident. We need them to be able to express themselves. We need to be able to do these together. But because of all of the pandemic, and because we're facing global economic challenges, that we also need to take care of making sure that children can and show up in class and are able to listen and be there. And so these are part of the conversations that they're having, but it's important to be able to have this dialogue so that that parents can understand this teachers' perspectives and vice versa. So keep moving. And in some cases, in Tanzania, they're also having their conversations will be about secondary school students. How do parents that have never gone to secondary school students help support their child in the exam process, which is a very stressful process? And how do teachers support that, but also prepare children? Not everybody is going to pass the exams and be able to be admitted into a higher education opportunity. So how do we also support students and families in that? So this is really kind of part of the important piece of the conversations. Okay. So the next part is really enacting a strategy. And what this means, it can mean different things. It can mean task forces, it can mean communication strategies, sometimes meetings and events, but communication strategies is actually the main strategy that most of the teams is their starting point. So all of the schools in Colombia said, okay, we need to have better ways of communicating with families. Whether it's WhatsApp groups or using technology, whether it's in-person listening, whether, thinking about ways that we can have better communication with families. there are teams that are also working more at the what we call the medium term. So thinking about programming for how do we do education programming for families? How do we do education programming for teachers on how to work with families? It's really also thinking about how do we think through some of the plans that we have in schools as well. In Colombia, they have a convivencia, the manual de convivencia, which is kind of their well-being and how to kind of general manual for all schools. And they realized they didn't have parents as part of this process, and they're developing sort of a new version of this manual, and they haven't had parents historically involved in this. So why not involve parents in having their voices of understanding them and having a more framework that really does also think about families. And then it's also thinking about, in some cases, of policies. So some teams that we're working with are also supporting district level policies. We're working with a team in India that is developing an education course for district education officers. We're working with a team in Zanzibar that's thinking about how does family school community engagement be part of the national plan. In Sierra Leone, how does it be part of the national plan and teacher professional development? And so these are some of the longer term strategies that have come out of this work, but schools often just need to start with a small step, which is often better communication with families. But here are some of the strategies that we'll be sharing with you that Sophie will share with you now. But before we jump into that, if there's any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. But I want to make sure Sophie has enough time. And so we'll have some time at the end for questions, but feel free as questions come to enter them in the chat. Handing to you, Sophie, for strategies.
Great. So we have sort of curated for you all today from our large database of strategies, some examples that fit into these three areas. So these areas will focus on one, making schools easy to access, 2, building trusting partnerships, and 3, supporting learning at home. So Emily just touched on this idea of making schools easy to access. And in our analysis of the research in the field of family engagement, we see that there's often this framing that some families, and often the most marginalized ones, are hard to reach. And this might be true in some cases, but when we dive into the research, we see that it actually might be more so that we have hard to reach schools rather than hard to reach families. And so as Emily explained, what we mean by that is that schools might not be welcoming and accessible to all families, maybe because of language or cultural barriers, or maybe families are unfamiliar with the school system, or they didn't go to school themselves, and so they don't feel comfortable navigating through that with their child. So with this in mind, we have some examples of how to intentionally make schools welcoming and accessible to all families. And then also on the other hand of that, how to be intentional about connecting with families outside of school, so that instead of always expecting families to come into the school, showing them that there's opportunities to meet families where they are and where they are most comfortable, as sort of a bridge in that process. So this first example comes from 2 states in the US, Connecticut and South Dakota. And this is an initiative that has taken place across several districts in both of these states. So this is an approach called welcoming walkthroughs, and it's done at the school level. So a school will assemble a group of parents, school staff, and sometimes secondary students, along with a facilitator, to actually physically assemble in a group and walk through their school together, using an evaluation tool to rank together how welcoming their school is across 4 dimensions. And those 4 dimensions are the physical environment of the school's practices and policies, and the school staff, and the written materials. So then after they do this walkthrough together, they're ranking across each of those 4 dimensions. The group comes together, and based on this data that they just collected, they create a responsive action plan for improvement. This second strategy is an example of a very specific way that a school could be more welcoming. So this might be an example of a strategy that would come out of a welcoming walkthrough, like I just described. So Wayne Township is a really large school district, public school district in Indiana in the United States. with a large population of immigrant families, and 70% of those families are not native English speakers. So as an entry point for being able to more meaningfully engage with these families, the district set up a system for creating newcomer welcome packets, which are booklets with school contact information, tips for navigating the school system, and information on how to access educational resources for students, but also for families themselves. And then importantly, what they did is they translated these booklets into the family's native language so that they could receive the information in the way that was most comfortable to them. And then alongside these booklets, to facilitate communication between teachers and families, the district set up a language hotline, which is like a phone hotline that does instant translation, so that there would be no barriers for teachers and parents being able to have conversations either over the phone or face-to-face. And then lastly, to sort of get at helping families to feel comfortable in the school environment, the district hosts monthly meetings in their schools for newcomer families, with activities designed to help families gain knowledge about the school system, and to feel more comfortable navigating it with their children. But also importantly, to connect newcomer families with other families in the district who come from a similar background and who may have been at the school for longer, so that they can offer each other peer support. And there's the sort of formalized system of like matching one family with another for a peer support network. And then on the flip side of this idea of making schools more welcoming for families to come into, here's one example that Emily mentioned already about intentionally engaging with families outside of the school. So in Sierra Leone, we have done research with 2 nonprofit organizations that support government schools. And we're working with these groups to collect survey data from parents. And these organizations said to us, hey, we know that nearly 75% of the parents at this school have not gone to secondary school themselves, and 45% never went to school at all. And so these groups told us what we're going to do for data collection is we will actually travel outside of the school and meet parents in common neutral spaces. So, for example, like a marketplace. And they found that this was a really effective way of capturing parent voice, especially the voices of parents who either were uncomfortable going to school or simply didn't have access or transportation to school. And now moving into sort of our second strategy area around building trusting partnerships. When we think about building trust, again, we're thinking about how are we listening to families' lived experiences and what they say they want for their children, and how are we connecting community knowledge and traditions to what children are learning in school. And an important piece of building trust can be, as Emily mentioned, to recognize families and communities as funds of knowledge, which is a helpful research term coined to describe how there are historically and culturally based ways of knowing and skills that come from the home or that come from individuals' own lived experiences. So here's an example about an approach to building trust and understanding between schools and families around families' own lived experiences. So Cajon Valley Union School District is a school district located in Southern California in the United States, very close to the border of Mexico. And there's a really large population of immigrant families in this district as well. About half of the student body in Cajon Valley are students of color, about a third are non-native English speakers, and almost 70% receive free or reduced price lunch, which means that they come from a lower socioeconomic family background. And meanwhile, the majority of the teachers and the school staff in the district have a different background. They are mostly middle class and mostly white. So over the years, the district has made like a variety of efforts and initiatives to create stronger, more trusting relationships between their schools and their families. And one of their strategies to do this is what they call poverty empathy simulations. So how this works is that during a district-wide staff meeting, parents volunteer to set up a poverty simulation in the school gymnasium. And then teachers and principals participate in the simulation to understand what it would be like to live in poverty in their town for a month. So then after the simulation activity, which is about 2 hours, they all sit together in sort of an auditorium for a debrief conversation where parents share their lived experiences in poverty with their child's educators. And we've heard from the parents and educators that have participated in this activity that this has helped to create a culture of listening and understanding and relationship building in their district. And here's a second example about creating deep partnerships with community and tapping into community knowledge and traditions around what a good quality education should look like. So this comes from a school district in British Columbia, Canada, called Sea to Sky. And for many years, this district struggled with the marginalization of their First Nation Indigenous students, which was evident in their graduation rates, which showed that only 30% of Indigenous students were graduating from high school, whereas 86% of non-Indigenous students were graduating. So that's a really large gap. And when the district began to redo their education plan, they looked at those stats and they decided that in order to provide equitable education for all of their students, they needed to gain the Indigenous community's insights and help shape their new education plan. So one way that they went about doing this was by convening working groups of diverse community members, which included principals, parents, and Indigenous elders. And they together worked to build consensus around the community's core beliefs about what education should look like in their school district. This, of course, wasn't the only strategy component in their district's plan, but it was an important one. And 10 years later, they found that the graduation rate of Indigenous students increased from around 30% to 92%, while the graduation rate of non-Indigenous students also rose to 96%. So in this situation, all students were benefiting from these working groups with the community Indigenous elders. And then our third and final strategy area to talk about today is about supporting learning at home. And by this, we mean how are educators and families able to work together to bridge classroom curriculum with learning at home. So one common example that we've encountered with lots of groups that we work with to establish simple methods of communication between schools and families is through digital chat groups. So one school, for example, that we work with in Brazil, they created digital groups on WhatsApp and Facebook by classroom so that all parents and teachers were directly connected in simple, easy, quick ways with each other, so that teachers could communicate with their students' parents around upcoming events or activities, but also, and maybe more importantly, around their students' assignments and what they were learning in school that day, so that the families were in the loop and could continue that conversation with their students at home. And this is a final example that is similar, but a little bit more targeted of the way of reinforcing classroom learning at home through apps that generate SMS messages to teachers from parents. So in the US, there is an example of this called Fast Talk, which is a digital program through which a teacher can push a personalized message to a parent in the parent's native language and assign them a task to do with their child that is related to something that their child did at school that day. And the text message will also include a little poll for the parent to indicate whether or not they completed the challenge or the task, and then to record the difficulty. And then the system for the next day would calibrate based on the results from that poll from the parent. And a similar example comes from Botswana, where there's a nonprofit group called Youth Impact that conducted a randomized control trial where they developed a tool that sent SMS messages to 500 parents on a weekly basis with math problems for the parent to do with their child. And then after almost 3 months of this intervention, the researchers found that this reduced innumeracy by 31% and also increased the time that families reported they spent with their they spent involved in their child's learning by 18%. So these 8 examples I shared and many others are available in our public strategy finder, which is what we call our evidence database of 62 strategies from around the world. So this database is online, and I can drop the link in the chat in just a moment. And you can filter through country, through student age, through level of tech, to find strategies that might be applicable in your context and that might be helpful or inspiring in your own work. And now we have a few minutes for open Q&A.
Thanks so much, Sophie. And I did drop the links to the strategy finder in the chat and to our kind of general research. I also look at the end of this year, we'll have all of the research that we've been doing with these 14 teams and co-creating these tools available as well for you. So please do stay in touch with us. And we will share a link to sort of your thoughts on how this workshop went. But please, in the last few minutes, if you have any thoughts or any questions, feel free. We can also stay on if you have additional questions, but hopefully this work will be helpful for you as you think of strategies. If you have strategies that have some evidence base to them, also please share them with us. Part of what we do at Brookings is help share across teams and help teams really talk and learn from each other.
Thank you so much, Emily and Sophie. That was absolutely incredible. I've got a couple of questions, actually, if we're just waiting for other people to come in. So just can I pick up on one thing you mentioned, Sophie, which was about the phone translation hotline. That sounded really interesting. Could you just say a little bit more how that worked practically? Was that literally a live translation resource, or I didn't quite get how that worked?
Yeah, so my understanding is that it is a live translation resource, like through some type of AI media system where you can plug, if you're on the phone, you use like an app or like a plugin that you speak into it in your language, it repeats back to the other person in the other language. And then if you're doing it in person, there might just be a pause for a second, but they made it publicly available at a district level.
Okay. Wow. Interesting resource. Do we have some more questions? There were a few questions earlier as well, actually. Just Kalyani talked earlier on about belief misalignment, but I think you kind of went through that actually, but whether you had any more questions, any more say on that. Kalyani asked about what exactly belief misalignment, and please share one real situation as per your research.
Great, yes. And Kalyani, feel free, was that answered for you sort of through the showing of the maps and talking about how we...
Emily, I have understood the scenarios, but can you give me one example, like what exactly the belief misalignment could be resolved, or maybe what kind of situation you have been analyzed? One, at least real incident.
Yeah, I think... So belief misalignment in one that, the one in Colombia, we were looking more at purpose of school. So the emphasis on the socio-emotional versus and then having them talk about that. In the case of some of the schools that are getting ready in England, they have kind of a difference on the barriers. So teachers thinking that families are not motivated and that's the main reason they're not getting involved. And then parents thinking actually it's the time and how things are structured. That's why we're not getting involved. That's probably one thing that they will talk about is these different perspectives. As we know with family school community engagement, oftentimes the tendency is sort of to put blame on the other. Parents are not involved from the side of teachers because they're not doing this. Parents also do the same. We're not involved because of the school, but it's also trying to get people to talk through these conversations and get to a common ground of how do we build partnerships and how do we understand that, the work that we each do is really important and complex as parents. And so how do we move past blame to actually concrete strategies that improve these communications? And so these are kind of what the strategy finder, there are some that, look at the home and look at the school of how to do this work. I think that's an important finding. And and outcome of this work together.
Great, thank you, Emily. I'm conscious we are at time. That has been an incredible session. I have got literally pages of notes, but I mean, the importance of listening has really come across for me today. That's a really, really strong point, and the difference between family involvement and family engagement and the strategies that have come out of the back of that, I think, are really, really important. Just to say, we will be sharing in the summary those links to those strategies. I think there's some amazing ones, just the examples you gave there, but I'm sure there's plenty more, and I'm sure the team, everybody would be really, really keen to see that. So thank you ever so much, Emily and Sophie. Maybe everybody could just ask everybody to give them a big hand. That's been an incredible session. I'm sure everybody found it as valuable as I did. Thank you very much. Just a reminder that we are back on Thursday. We have Rosie Nice from Magic Consulting, who's talking about building a coaching culture, same time on Thursday. So hope to see everybody there. And also, I think Emily has just dropped, or Sophie has just dropped a form in just to ask for some feedback on the session. So I'm sure they would appreciate it if you could give them some feedback, which is just in the chat moving forward. Okay, everybody, thank you so much for joining. Appreciate that. Obviously, let us know your feedback, and do obviously follow Emily and Sophie online. I'm sure they'd appreciate that. And we'll see everybody again soon. Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you so much.